Good morning. Hope you're having a great day. A little thought for the day. So, there's a famous story with Rabbi Yitzchok of Berditchev, the famous defender of the Jewish people. And it's a very beautiful story about the time before Rosh Hashanah, when everyone in the community would come to write what we would call a pidyon nefesh, a note asking for a good year that they would give to the Rebbe, Rabbi Yitzchok, and he would pray for their family to be blessed with a good year. And one year, Rabbi Yitzchok told his secretary, he told the person in charge, that the only way that people could come in to give him a note and to get blessed with a new year is if they paid a ruble, 1 ruble per person, which was a lot of money. And he said no exceptions. And here there was this this woman that was a widow, and she had a child, and she had no money. But she couldn't live without a little prayer and blessing from the Rebbe, a pidyon nefesh for the new year. And she went around scraping and looking for money to be able to be blessed with the new year, but she didn't have much. And the time was getting closer. It was almost Yom Kippur, and the Rebbe would go to shul, and she wouldn't get the blessing, she wouldn't get the prayer that she so wanted. And finally, she was able to scrape together 1 ruble. And she takes her little baby in her hands, and she runs to the Rebbe. And she looks at the Rebbe with tears in her eyes and plea, and she says, Rebbe, I could only find 1 ruble. That's it. I scraped together from everything. I sold what I could. I collected what I could. Could you please give a blessing to me and my little young child? And the Rebbe looks at her and the secretary, and I said, there's no exceptions. I said 1 ruble per person. I can't give you both a blessing. I'll give you a blessing. Your son is a baby anyways. He has no sins. Don't worry. And the woman breaks down crying, and she says, Rebbe, how could I do it? If my son doesn't get blessed with a new year, then what is it worth it for me? Forget about me. I'm already an old woman. Give my son the blessing. And at that moment, I believe Yitzchok looked up to God and says, God, there's no more need to say anything. This is what I say for the new year. Look at the sacrifice of a Jewish mother for her child. She's ready to give up everything, even her own blessing, just that her little baby child should get the blessing. You are like our mother, God. You are like our parent. Forgive your children and give your children a new year. This was a style of Rabbi Berditchev, and he used this as a plea to Hashem. Why do I say this? I merited to go with my family last summer. It feels like years ago, but we went the entire family to Israel. And one of my most moving times and days was when we took a fortified bus and we went to the tomb of Rachel, our matriarch, who was buried in Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem, during the Oslo Accords, unfortunately, the entire Bethlehem was given back to the Palestinians. But what they did was they built a tremendous fortress around the tomb of Rachel, and you drive in, and this tall concrete walls, and you come to pray. And it's a very emotional place. You know why it's an emotional place? Let me take you back to this week's Torah portion. Jacob is about ready to pass away, and he calls his son Joseph, and he pleads with him. He says, Joseph, I don't want to be buried in Egypt. There were many reasons. He didn't want to become a god to the Egyptians. He didn't want them to embalm him. But he says, I refuse to be buried there. I want you to take me to the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron. And then suddenly Jacob takes a detour. And he looks at his son and he says, I know you're wondering that when your mother passed away, I didn't bring her to the tomb of the patriarchs. But I buried her on the way in Bethlehem right where I was. And as Rashi, the classic commentary on the Torah, says, you know why Jacob said this? And the Rebbe gives a long explanation on this. Because Jacob knew that now as he's pleading with his son, bury me in the tomb of the patriarchs, which is such an important place, that Joseph would feel bad. What about my mother? So Jacob tells him, your mother was buried where she was because that's what she wanted, and by divine intervention. And he quotes from Jeremiah, the famous verses of Jeremiah, that when the Jews were exiled from the Holy Land in the first destruction of the temple by the Babylonians, by Nebuchadnezzar, and they were on their way going, and they happened to come the way they took, the way the Jews were exiled, went through Bethlehem, and the Jews fell down on the tomb of Rachel, and they cried. And Rachel went up and she cried to God, and she said, Rachel Mavaka al Baneh, Rachel cried, and she says, I won't stop. God, how could you do this? And God, suddenly a voice comes out. This is the Haftorah we read on Rosh Hashanah. And the voice comes out and says, God says to Rachel, stop crying. There's going to be a reward for your crying, and there's hope for your future. Your children will return to their place. And what Jacob was basically telling Joseph is, Joseph, I know you're wondering, and I know it pains you, why your mother wasn't buried in the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs. But this was your mother's wish. She wanted to be there for her children on their darkest and hardest days when they were being exiled, so they could cry and put their head on her shoulder and cry, and she could soothe them and comfort them in the time of their pain. This is the story of a Yiddishe mama, a Jewish mother, a mother who is ready to sacrifice and give up 2,000 years of basking in the holiness and the divinity of being buried in the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs, just that her children, who were sinners, who didn't listen to prophets at that time, who went against everything that God was saying, who was being exiled, so they could be next to her, and they could use her shoulder to be soothed. A father also loves his child, but sometimes when they're sinners, he could give up. But a Yiddishe mama, the essence of a Yiddishe mama is never giving up for her children, on her children. And that's what Jacob was telling, the Rebbe asked in his talk, why didn't Jacob speak to Joseph about this? He's already living in Egypt for 17 years, or before he was sold. Why didn't he explain him this? And the Rebbe explained that Jacob knew the whole time that his son trusted him and wasn't upset, but he knew that emotionally it hurt him. Why is my mother not buried there? And he wanted to explain to him that this was your mother's request, because your mother loved her children. And a Jewish mother, a Yiddishe mama, will do anything for her children to comfort them. Chaim Nachman Bialik, the famous Russian poet who immigrated to Israel and wrote in Hebrew, and he once quoted why there's so much sigh and like sadness in some of his poetry. And he says the story how he was growing up, he was one of 7, and his father passed away when he was a young kid, and his mother took on a job. She worked in a store and a factory all day to support the 7 children, and then she would come home at night all worn out and falling apart, and she would try to help her to make bread and stuff for her children. And one night his mother put him to bed, and after his mother put him to bed, she thought he was sleeping, and she went into the kitchen. She was kneading dough to make bread for her children, and suddenly he came out because he was up, and he saw his mother saying a prayer to God. God, as she was kneading the dough, may I merit to bring up God-worthy children who will follow in the ways of Torah and Judaism. And as she said it, there were tears rolling down her ears. And he says one of the tears fell into the dough as she kneaded it. And he says, the next day I ate that bread. And that sob, that Yiddishe krechts of a mother worrying for her children, became a part of who I am. That's the gift of a Yiddishe mama. And that's what Jacob was telling Joseph. Joseph, at this moment, you want to know, don't be pained. This is what your mother wanted. And that's why till today, in 1995, when Yitzchok Rabin was doing the Oslo Accords, he was going to give up the tomb of Rachel. And in a famous story, the chief rabbi, Rabbi Lau, went up to him and said, you don't give up on the mother. You never give your mother's place. And there was a Chaver Knesset, the Knesset member, his name was Menachem Porush, and he fell onto the prime minister's hands, and he was crying and sobbing, and he pleaded with him. He says, please don't give up on our mother Rachel. She's the one who comforts us. And that's when they decided to build the big concrete barriers on all sides and make a pathway for Jews to come visit the tomb of Rachel, even after they gave up the whole Bethlehem. The gift of a Jewish mother. You've probably seen it with your own mother, with your own grandmother. The love, the unconditional love and self-sacrifice that a mother will have for their children, against all logic, against even when there's rejection, when there's pain, when there's suffering. And that's the gift of Yiddishe Mama that we get from Rachel. And that's why Jacob mentions it to Joseph. May Hashem give us that we should all live to merit a lot of time and celebratory times with our mothers and be the best mothers and fathers we can be for our children. Have a good day.